So today we begin a series that has been years in the making. It's one that's been very close to my heart. It's never far from my mind. Um, and yes, we're going to be investigating a problem, but we're not going to leave it there. And we're going to propose a solution. And so the series I call the Anger Epidemic. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the epidemic that's in our world today. Uh, but we're not going to leave it there because we're going to talk about the cure for this disease, this illness, this plague in society. And, uh, and ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to see how God has provided a solution in his Son. And I call that solution the worship cure. So let's look at the very word epidemic. Epidemic comes from two words, epi, which is among or upon, and demos, which means people. It could also speak of a region, a district, and it means a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. So normally people think of there's an outbreak, and when an outbreak uh, becomes great in a certain locale, it then is called epidemic. It's an epidemic. Um, Now we recently with COVID had something that was called a pandemic. It meant it was everywhere. It was worldwide. It was not just an epidemic located in a particular community at a particular time. It was everywhere. And this word epidemic, more so than the word pandemic, can also speak of other things besides a physical disease. It can speak of a sudden, widespread occurrence of a particular undesirable phenomenon. Like we speak of a crime epidemic. There's a crime epidemic in our cities. There's a depression. There's a depression epidemic. Um, and so the word epidemic really means that which is common to or affecting a whole people. And nowadays, anger, and I would say rage even, is reaching epidemic proportions in our society. Have you noticed that we all seem to be getting on each other's nerves much more nowadays? Um, I mean, it's almost frightening how people have this hair trigger temper where you dare not look at somebody the wrong way or brush into them to where they take umbrage and are ready to go at you. Um, when I was growing up, uh, I don't even think that there was such a phenomenon, or at least there was nothing called road rage. And all of a sudden, this became a thing, road rage. Well, nowadays, there's not just road rage, there's plane rage. More and more, we're seeing these videos of people on planes just fighting with each other and fighting with the, 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 the crew. And what is going on with people? Uh, there's something called desk rage. You know, desk rage is anger in the workplace. Um, you never know when you go into work, you know, what might happen with some disgruntled employee that is, or some workplace violence that might occur because people becoming increasingly unhinged. And then there's something called shopping rage. And, you know, you're online and someone cuts in front of somebody else or something happens, and all of a sudden, you know, I guess we're seeing it all the more, well, you know, on these videos nowadays that they come out with, where people have everybody has a camera and a cell phone and taking a picture of, you know, people brawling in the aisles, pulling each other's hair, you know. So, you know, there's violence spilling out into places that a while back we didn't even imagine that you'd find violence in that place. Yeah, in our supermarkets, in our schools, in our sanctuaries. I mean, we live in a day where you have to have armed uh, guards in churches. Uh, you know, around here where we live, the police are hired to be in a sanctuary. How how crazy is that? And we're not even going so much to talk about politics. Politics has always gotten people inflamed, but I mean, uh, has it ever been a time when people are angrier or more at each other's throats or angrier about the political situation and whose side you're on, etc.? So, I mean, the temperature is really rising uh, in our world. And 2,000 years ago, the Bible predicted what the real danger of these last days would be. And you know, people are all concerned about uh, what's happening to the planet, and many people are afraid for what's happening in terms of the climate, etc. Um, but Scripture doesn't talk about the danger of the last days being found in the atmosphere around us or in the rising of the oceans. No, there's a far greater danger that Scripture speaks of, a greater peril that the Bible speaks of. And it has to do with the type of people that are inhabiting the planet in these last days. In 2 Timothy 3, starting in verse 1, Paul says, "This know also." Do we know this? We're finding this out. That in the last days, perilous times shall come, dangerous times shall come. Why? Because men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent. Incontinent, what that in the original is saying is they will be powerless. They will be unable to control themselves. They will be intemperate. They won't be able to control their emotions, their anger, their desires, their passions. And because of that, they will be fierce. They'll be despisers of those that are good. They'll be traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. So the danger, the peril in these last days has everything to do with not what's out there in the world around us, in the earth around us, but everything that has to do with what's going on inside of us. Anger is doing greater damage to our lives than any natural event outside of us can ever do. Homes, marriages are being destroyed because of anger. Not only families, but nations Nation shall rise against nation. Individuals, a man's foes will be they of his own household. There'll be strife and distress of nations, and men's hearts will fail them as they look upon the things that are coming on the earth. It's not just the things happening in the heavenlies, it's the things that are happening between human beings that are causing a distress, that are causing an uneasiness in society. And people are saying, something has to be done. The world is going crazy. People are becoming more and more frightening. Panic is setting in because civilization is not so civil anymore. It's becoming more unhinged and out of hand with each passing day. You almost hate to find out. You go on you used to look at the newspaper, but now you go on the internet, and what new crazy thing has happened? It's a frightening thing, and people are more ferocious. Men will be incontinent, and they will be fierce. They're becoming ferocious, more ferocious by the day. The world in every corner appears like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. And there's a certain dread afoot. There's a certain despair that people are starting to feel. And, there was a time when I think people had some kind of hope, but it was a naive hope that mankind was evolving, societal evolution, that we were coming to a greater plane of existence where man would simply become more and more loving and kind and understanding. And, this is the age of Aquarius, and we're coming into some place where man will walk hand in hand and arm with man. Well, that has been a naive hope that is being more and more discounted by the day. No, the world is not becoming more civilized. It's becoming more uncivilized. The 20th century was not there was more bloodshed and war in the 20th century than in all the other centuries. And who's to say that it's going to suddenly take a turn for the better because human beings are going to become kinder and gentler? No, it's becoming more volatile. It's becoming more dangerous. The world is becoming more violent. Here's how Jesus described the last days before he would return. But as the days of Noah were, so also the coming of the Son of Man shall be. Yes, in the days of Noah, the inhabitants of the earth were carrying on their normal activities. They were eating and they were drinking and they were marrying. But what else was going on in the days of Noah? What was the temper of the day? Well, we're told in Genesis 6:11 what the temper of the day was. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And it was this violence that God looked upon, and it says he repented that he made man. It grieved him to his heart what he was seeing, the violence that he was seeing in the earth. And it triggered his judgment. Now let's understand something, that violence has its roots in anger. And it was this way from the very beginning. We look at the story of Cain and Abel, and we see the part that anger played in the first murder. The first mention of anger in the Bible is in Genesis 4:5, the very first time anger is mentioned. Genesis 4:5. But unto Cain and to his offering God had not respect. Cain was very wroth. He was very angry, and his countenance fell. So this word angry, there's different words for anger, but this particular word for anger has the root meaning to cause fire to burn. And it differs from other words used for anger in that it emphasizes the kindling of a fire. So it speaks of anger that could wax hotter and hotter. Cain's anger was very hot. It was vehement. It was great. And it's interesting to see that in English we have so many words that describe these different gradations of anger. You just got to look this up in a thesaurus, and you see it goes all the way from what we would consider low-level anger to extreme anger. Look at all these words that we use: irritate, annoy, exasperate, peeve, frustrate, aggravate, irk, rankle, rile, vex, provoke, offend, antagonize, inflame, incense, infuriate, enrage, madden. And then the last two that I saw in this thesaurus were drive mad or drive crazy. You know, anger used to, the craziness or mental illness or insanity used to be called madness. That's what it was called, madness. There's a reason for that. Because the man who is mad, or the madman, if his anger is not checked, can become the madman. We say things like, "You're driving me mad. I'm going to go crazy. This situation is driving me nuts. It's driving me mad." Well, what are we talking about? I'm angry. So when a fire is low, it's not very dangerous. But when a fire grows intense and is roaring, you better watch out, because a fire can be very dangerous. And out of control anger that's waxing very hot, like Cain's anger waxed hot. He was very wroth. That kind of anger leads to what? It leads to violence. And so we read in Genesis 4:8, and Cain talked with Abel, his brother. I wonder if Abel knew what was going on under the surface with his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field, just talking to each other, that suddenly Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him. The first murder, the first act of violence, is precipitated by anger. Now, he's angry for a reason. He's envious, but his envy turns to anger. And he rises up against his brother. So anger puts people at odds with each other. They can vie for the same job. They can vie for the same land. They can vie for the same woman. They can vie for the attention of the same God. And it can create this friction and this anger towards each other. And wherever there is anger, there is the specter of violence. That's why the angry person is so frightening. So today, what I want to do is I want to examine this phenomenon closer. And I want to do so both from a biblical viewpoint and an experiential viewpoint. Today's lesson in particular, specifically, is going to be, be looking at the madman, a subject of fear. And that's first and foremost what a angry person is. He's frightening. He is the source and he is the subject of fear. When we try to we get very unnerved around people when they become angry. We know that in some way there's danger, and it's frightening. And not just a madman. We speak of a madman when we use the word man, we're using it in the generic sense, but a mad woman is frightening. A mad child is frightening. How often do parents tiptoe around their kids because they don't want to set their kids off? I don't want to make them angry. We worry about the angry child when they grow up. Oh no, look at their temper now. When they become a teenager, what am I going to have to deal with? What about a mad king? What about a mad world? And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with fear because of dealing with anger in others. David certainly knew this. In Psalm 18, verse 4, he writes, "The floods of ungodly men made me afraid." The floods of ungodly men did what? It made me afraid. And in what context did David write this? Well, we're told in the beginning of Psalm 18, in the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. And so here's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at two kings. Both of these kings in the Old Testament can be looked upon as certified madmen. The one is King Saul. King Saul literally was what would be called today a paranoid schizophrenic. He was psychotic in his anger. And the other king that we will be looking at is Nebuchadnezzar. Two kings, one a Jewish king, one a Gentile king, but both known for their volatile anger. It's anger that leads them to violent outbursts and rage. And as we go further into our series, we're going to be going very much into depth concerning King Nebuchadnezzar and looking at the various forms of anger. We'll touch upon it today towards the end of this lesson. But we're gonna really look at Nebuchadnezzar. But today, for the beginning, we're going to be looking at King Saul, the frightful madness of Saul. And we're primarily going to examine the story of Saul and David. And we're going to be looking at the angry person as a source of trauma. So, anger produces fear. Fear produces trauma. Trauma speaks of a wound. Trauma wounds the spirit. And David, he faced Goliath with such a fearlessness. But oh, when he had to live with the angry King Saul, what effect did living in this palace, being around this angry king, What effect did it have on David, on David's spirit? So this is what I want us to look at. I want us to start reading in 1 Samuel 18, verse 6, and let's see what happened between David and Saul. And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Once again, we get into this area of envy and comparison, and one person being angry that another is getting more praise than they're getting, and more recognition than they're getting, and more honor than they're getting. And this is one form of anger called indignant anger. And Saul becomes indignant that he's the king, and yet this David somehow is gaining more favor in the eyes of the people than he is. And in verse 8, it says, and Saul was very wroth. It's the same wording that spoke of Cain. He's vehemently angry about this slight that he's receiving. And the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And so this is building up in him, this looking at David as a threat to him. And he's already troubled by an evil spirit, but this situation only riles up those spirits even more. And in verse 10 we read, and it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. I wonder what he was prophesying. And David played with his hand, as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. I can just imagine the uneasiness of David. Why does he have to hold this javelin in his hand? It's like somebody who likes to hold a gun or a knife. Can you imagine a person who is something is off about that person, but they like weapons? They like to hold a gun or a knife, or they're just walking around with it. The uneasiness that David feels in this house, and he's doing his best to play the harp and to quiet down the evil spirit that's at work in Saul, but he can only do so much. And so wherever there's this kind of anger, there's a potential for violence, and David knows it. And yes, it breaks out in verse 11. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And it's a good thing he wasn't as good at aim as David was in hitting Goliath, because he missed. And Saul and David avoided out of his presence twice. And I focus on this word, avoid. Isn't that what we do with people who are angry? We try to stay out of their way. We try to avoid them. When I was in New York the other day with my son, we got on the subway, and I was about to sit down. Oh, there's 2 seats right here. This is good. We got a seat. We'll sit down together over here. And then I look over in the corner, and there's somebody who looks a little strange, looks a little unhinged. I said, you know what, maybe we should move down to some other chairs at another part of the train. You never know with certain people. You look at them the wrong way, they look at you the wrong way. So there's an uneasiness. We kind of want to avoid, we want to steer clear of people who um, could be mad. And there's people who live in homes. There's little boys and little girls who know to stay away from a parent who is always angry. It could suddenly flare up in some way, or a sibling, a brother or a sister. I just know that there's been people who uh, learned how to navigate those waters in a home. But there's a time when it's not an issue of avoiding or staying away from, it's actually getting away from or escaping. And that's what happened eventually with David. In 1 Samuel 21:13, we read, "And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath." So there's a fight or flight instinct that we have. And sometimes the instinct is, I have to get away. And we read David fled for fear. So what is the effect that a mad individual has on us? The effect is fear. And what is our first instinct? If it's first to avoid as much as we can, the next instinct is escape. I have to get away. We have to put some distance between us and that source of our fear. And here's the problem. Sometimes, though, we in our running, we can get ourselves into a bigger mess. Think of a young woman who is tired of living in a home where there's anger, a father or a mother that's just uh, angry all the time, and it's unsettling, it's unnerving to be around them. I don't want to live this way. And then what do? They move out, they run away, and they run right into the arms of even a greater problem, a boyfriend, or they get married, and their husband is worse than their father. So David's running away and running from the mad king and the madhouse of the palace of Saul. When he goes to Achish, it's kind of going from the frying pan into the potential fire. So in 1 Samuel 21:11, we read, "And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David, the king of the land?" Who is this guy? This guy is David. This is the guy who killed Goliath. Mind you, Goliath is a Philistine. He was a citizen of Gath. And here David is going to his town, to the king of Gath. And they said, and so the servants say, "Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? Tell me, who are the 10,000s that he killed? 10,000 Philistines." So yeah, David is a celebrity in Israel, but he's also a celebrity in Gath, and not in a good way. You know, no doubt David knows what the Philistines did to Samson. When they finally got a hold of Samson, who was their antagonist and who was the one who was killing them left and right, what they do to Samson? Well, they plucked out his eyes and they chained him to the pillars of their banqueting hall, and they mocked him and ridiculed him. And so David is thinking he's in a similar predicament. These guys may shortly decide that they don't want him around, and they may decide to do with him like they did to Samson. So what does he decide to do? Well, he knows what he can do. He can act like a madman. In verse 13, we read, and he changed his behavior before them and feigned himself mad in their hands and scrabbled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Why does he do this? Very simple. David understands the effect of a madman on others. He himself has wanted to get away from a madman. And he knows that when Achish looks at him and says, this guy is literally crazy. He's snapped. All the pressure that's been upon him, his running from the persecution of Saul, he's no longer a threat to us. He's crazy, but I don't want this guy around. So we read in verse 14, then said Achish unto his servants, lo, ye see, the man is mad. Wherefore then have you brought him to me? Have I need of madmen that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? We want our homes to be places of peace and security. We want our homes to be a sanctuary, an oasis. We don't want our homes to be places where there's the unsettling presence of a madman, of a person who's filled with rage and anger, perhaps. And yeah, the question is, shall this fellow come into my house? Who wants to live with a madman? We try to avoid crazy. We don't invite it in. But what if you can't get away? It's one thing for Achish to say, get him out of here. But what if somebody is in your house and you can't get away? To live in such a situation is to live in a dark prison house. It's to be trapped in a tense, unpredictable situation, which is traumatizing. And I know, I remember to this day how that felt. I'll just tell you a little bit about my story growing up. My father was an angry man. And he was also someone who drank. And when he drank, he was an angry drunk. And his anger was inflamed even more through the drink. And Proverbs 20, verse 1 tells us about the effect of alcohol to make anger more inflamed. It says, wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. And I used to lay in bed at night waiting for my father to come home from the bar. And I didn't know whether he was going to come in and be so drunk that he'd go right to bed, or be not that drunk, have half a bag on, as we used to say. And when he would come in, he would not be out of it and just ready to go to bed. That's when the trouble would start. I didn't quite understand what his anger was all about. I have a better understanding now, but back then I had no idea why he was so angry. But he took his anger out on my mother. And I would hear him yelling, and there was tension and unpredictable. There was an unpredictability in the air of what might happen and the violence that might occur. And so I lived in this feeling of being trapped. I could not get out of my home. And there's many who understand what I'm talking about here, whether it be a woman or a man living in a home with someone who is out of control, angry. Yes, maybe alcohol or drugs have something to do with it. Maybe not. Maybe that's just their normal state. And there's abuse and there's violence and there's fear of living in that environment, and there's a sense of being trapped. And this is what happens being around. This is the effect of being around anger. It's frightening. It's also unpredictable because people who are mad are unhinged. That's part of the terror. You live in suspense of what might happen. You have to keep a track on them out of the corner of your eye. You never know what they might do. I didn't know at times sitting at a table with my father when all of a sudden he might slap me across my face for something I didn't even know what I had actually done. At times when he would get so angry out of nowhere that he would lift up the stove and then drop it down on the ground. A javelin might fly out of nowhere. Uh, and that's why it's a mad person. An angry person is also dangerous because there's always an element of harm or violence. There was a time when he was angry and, he didn't have a javelin, but he had a knife. And he was coming towards my mother in our living room. He got the knife out of the kitchen drawer. And whether he was threatening to kill himself, whether he was threatening to kill her, I can't even remember. But my mother just simply said, "We have to get out." First time we fled, I think we were in our pajamas. We just fled down the street in the dark. And yes, there's times when it is necessary to flee. There's times when it is necessary to do all you can to get out of that kind of a situation. But for so many, fleeing is not easy. What do you do when you can't get away? What do you do when you feel if you get away, that angry person is going to be following you? My mother felt to perhaps go to her father. Uh, but there was fear there of being stalked and what my father might do in anger that his family had left. So there was a sense of being trapped. We were in a prison. I ministered in jail in New York, Rikers Island, for many years. And one of my main reasons for ministering to the inmates at Rikers Island is because of my desire to help their children and my desire to help their spouses, their girlfriends, their family members. I one day posed a question to the men there in our meeting. And I said, how many of you are in here because of anger? Because you were angry with someone and you did something in your anger and it got you in trouble. How many of you are in here because of anger? Do you know a majority of men raise their hand? I would say at least 80, 90% of the men there raised their hand that it was that The crime they committed happened because of anger. And, we need to have compassion, not just on the victims of people who are angry, but on the angry person themselves. What does an angry person do when they've lost control? They no longer know how to control their anger. What do they do when their anger not only frightens others, but it frightens them? Where do they run to? How do they get away from themselves? How do you get away from yourself? You can potentially avoid the presence of a mad person. You can avoid it, escape it. But what about if you are the madman? How do you get away from yourself? Let's understand something. The angry person has a very hard time living with himself. Job 18:4 says, he teareth himself in his anger. The madman is not only a terror to others, he's a terror to himself. He not only puts others in the torment of fear, but he's in torment himself. He's not easy for others to live with, but it's not easy for him to live with himself. Is there help for that person who somehow has done something or knows that they can do something to hurt others and comes to a place where they're frightened of themselves? And somehow they can't get away from themselves. They can't stop themselves from reacting the way they do. They can't stop their emotions when they're under the influence of anger. What's the solution? Oftentimes, here's what such a person does who has this spiraling anger. They try to get away from people. They try to get away from situations that cause them anger. They try to lessen opportunities for them to become angry by isolating themselves. And this is what we see with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, we're going to look at chapters 1, 2, and 3. There's anger in those 3 chapters. There's anger directed towards people who are failing him, who are disappointing him, who are frustrating him, who are disrespecting him. He has high standards and he expects much from people, and he places demands on people, and he can't stand and he can't tolerate the failure and the weaknesses and the imperfections of others. He can't put up with disrespect from people. He would create a perfect world around him, but alas, he doesn't get that perfect world. There's a world that we would like to be, and then there's the world that is. There's our utopian world, and then there's a reality that we have to live in. And Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 suddenly goes mad, and his madness drives him away from a world that he can't stand, that he can't tolerate, that he can't face without rage. His anger finally drives him crazy, mad, and his madness drives him from people. So is this the solution? Is the solution for us that I just have to, I can't be around people? I can't, I can't be around my family anymore. I can't be around, I can't be in workplace situations. I can't live around people. I have to go someplace far off, and I have to live in a cabin in the wilderness. We can run from circumstances that we feel are driving us crazy, but when are we going to face the real problem? We flee from the angry person because we're frightened, but oftentimes we're most afraid of ourselves. We're afraid of our own anger. And the fact of the matter is, we don't really like ourselves when we're angry. We don't like who we become, both inwardly and outwardly. We don't like getting bent out of shape. Think about how a person's face is, it gets so bent out of shape when they're angry. An angry person is not beautiful to look at, are they? We know we look ugly when we're angry because other people look angry, look ugly when they're angry. And even beyond looking ugly, we act ugly when we're angry. And we know why people don't want to be around us, want to steer clear from us, don't want to hire us, because they don't want to be around us when we're angry. Frankly, they don't like us and we don't like ourselves. And devils take advantage of this kind of situation in order to do what? In order to drive us to isolation. We want to be around the fewest people possible. Maybe we say, I hate people. Well, we hate people because people make us angry. And we hate ourselves when we get angry. We'd rather be with the beast of the field like Nebuchadnezzar. We'd rather be just, well, I just want a dog. I just want a cat. I don't want to be around people. And this is something that this being driven away from people is something we see in the New Testament as well, with this Gadarene demoniac that Jesus meets. In Luke's account, we are told that he wore no clothes, neither abode in any house, but in the tombs. He would rather be with the dead than with the living. In Mark's account, his pitiable state is even more emphasized. He was not only out of his mind, but he's out of control. No man could bind him, no, not with chains, because that he had been often bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces. Neither could any man tame him. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. Yes, he's tearing himself in his wrath. He's not happy with himself. He certainly doesn't want to be around others. But can he live with himself? No, he can't live with himself. And just like Nebuchadnezzar, we're told that he was driven of the devil into the wilderness and away from people. So he's frightening. He's frightening to others. He's frightening to himself. But I'm going to tell you, he frightens everyone but one man. He doesn't frighten Jesus. Jesus steps on the scene. And Jesus is not frightened. Why? Because he knows that he has deliverance and healing in his hand. He is the Son of Righteousness who has arisen with healing in his wings. He's the great physician who's not come for the well, but for the sick. Not just the sick in body, but the sick in mind and the sick in soul. He is the Christ, the anointed one. And we read in Luke 4:18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. And this is what he says of himself when he comes to Nazareth, where he was brought up. And he quotes from Isaiah. Speaking of himself, he says, this day, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. I'm here. I am the Messiah. And the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Why? Because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, those who are imprisoned even in their own sins and their own ways that have developed over the course of years, and they don't know how to change themselves. This Gadarene demoniac didn't become this way overnight. He was once a little boy. He was once a teenager. and he slowly lost grip on reality. He slowly became this person who was infiltrated by all manner of evil spirits, so much so that there was a legion existing there. And Jesus comes to preach deliverance to the captive, to the recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. So he is the answer. He is the cure. Yes, there's anger in our world. Yes, there's a problem. There's anger in our politics. There's anger in our streets. There's anger on our roads. There's anger in our homes and in our hearts. But God has provided a solution, a cure, a rescuing from such a dreadful state of affairs. He himself is the answer. God, in the beginning, was the Word, and the Word was with God. The same was in the beginning with God, and was God, and that Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Yes, he was the Word that was God, and he was the Word that was made flesh, and he dwelt among us. Where we were overcome, he overcame. He was tempted in all points like as we are, yet he did not sin. He experienced anger, but although he was angry, he did not sin. And here is the word to us. Anger in and of itself is not sin. It's what we do with that anger. It's our response to the way we feel. We all feel angry at times. But is that anger resolved by the Spirit of God? Are we helped by the Spirit of Christ? Do we respond as Christ responded? Can we be angry and sin not? That's what we're called to be. Ephesians 4:26 says, "Be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath." And so there's an answer. And we're going to look specifically at this worship cure. We're going to look specifically at how Jesus overcame the world, the flesh, and the devil, how he overcame them in the wilderness and throughout his life. And we're going to look at these three forms of anger from the life of Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll be looking at the book of Daniel and see that in Daniel chapter 1, we are dealing with frustrated anger. In Daniel chapter 2, we're dealing with offended anger. And in Daniel chapter 3, we're dealing with indignant anger. And then if these three forms of anger, and I'm going to tell you, these three forms of anger are not sinful in and of themselves, but if we do not respond correctly, what happens? Ways of evil form in us. Envy not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways. There's a way of oppression. Frustrated anger leads to oppression. Offended anger leads to a way of obsession. And indignant anger leads to a way of aggression. We don't want to be an oppressor. We don't want to be an obsessor. We don't want to be an aggressor. And this is, we could say, well, I'm not that bad. But we all deal with these three forms of anger. And unless we get help, don't say it can't be me. No, these things can form an evil way, a sinful way, an ungodly way. And you can become somebody who is crazy. And be oppressive and be aggressive and be obsessive. So This can happen to anyone. Ecclesiastes 9:3 says, "Yea, also the heart of the sons of men is full of evil, and madness is in their heart while they live, and after that they go to the dead." Yes, full of evil. The hearts of men, not just some, the hearts of men is full of evil, and madness is in their heart while they live. It's a universal problem. It's not just a problem for Jew or a problem for Gentile or a problem for this race or for that people or for men or for women. It's a universal problem. It's in the hearts of the sons of men. And it's dire. Are we going to find God's solution? Has God given us a solution? Yes, he has given a solution, and that solution is found in one place and in one name and in one man, and that is the man Christ Jesus. Jesus is the sanest, soundest man who ever lived. He never possessed a spirit of fear. He always lived in a spirit of power and love and a sound mind. And he needs to be the subject of our focus and our meditation. He is the perfect man. Psalm 37:37 says, "Mark the perfect man and behold the upright, for the end of that man is peace." We need to observe Jesus. We need to observe him intensely and intently, and we need to learn of his ways. And that's what we're going to be doing as we go forward in this series. We're going to look at how he worshiped God and overcame. He was driven into the wilderness, not by the devil, but he was led by the Spirit. He was led, not driven. He was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil and to overcome the devil and to overcome the world and to overcome the ways that are so common to flesh. And he overcame not just through the word, he overcame through 3 specific acts of worship, which we find in Revelation 4:11. Revelation 4:11 says, this is what God has called all creation to do. This is what the Creator has called all men to do. Everything he's created has been called to give him what he's worthy of, to give him. Worship is an act of giving. What are we to give God? Revelation 4:11, "Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things. For thy pleasure they are and were created." So Jesus comes as God in the flesh. He comes as someone who is worthy to be worshiped, but he also comes fully as a man to do what no other man ever perfectly did before. And what is that? To perfectly worship the Father. And in perfectly worshiping the Father and in perfectly giving the Father glory, honor, and power, he overcame sin of all kinds. He overcame unrighteous, sinful anger. And so we want to explore in depth the nature of anger. We're going to look at that as we look at Nebuchadnezzar. But we also want to see how Jesus overcame frustrated anger by giving God power. He had a godly response to frustration, and there was no oppression. He was oppressed, but there was no oppression at work in Jesus. He overcame offended anger by giving God honor. He had a godly response to offense, and there was no obsession at work in his life. And then he overcame indignant anger by giving God glory. He had a godly response to indignation, and there was no aggression in him. So there's so much to learn from the life and the spirit and the witness of Christ. And we don't sit at the feet of any man. He calls us to come to him. He invites us to come to him, to not run from situations in life that bring out the worst in us. He invites us to come to him, receive him. If we receive him and he's living in us, greater is he that's within us than he who is in the world. If he is living in us, if we are recipients of his grace, then where sin did abound, grace does much more abound. Sin does not have to have dominion over us. Why? We're not under the law. We're no longer in the flesh, but we're in the Spirit. And the Spirit is in us. We're under grace. And we have a potential. We have a power in us to be able to respond as Christ responded and abide in him and walk even as he walked. But there's so much to grow up in him for. Let's grow up into him who is the perfect man. But the first thing is to do this, to come unto him. And we come unto him continually. In Matthew 11:28, we read, come unto me. He says, come unto me. All ye that labor and are heavy laden, you might be laboring, you might be trying. I want to overcome. I want to do better. I don't want to be this laden with this anger problem. He says, come to me. I'm going to give you rest. And I want you to take my yoke upon you. And I want you to learn of me. You've learned bad habits. You've learned from father or mother, or maybe just yourself. You've learned from the world how to respond in ungodly ways to the situations you face. You've learned how to run away and cut people off. You've learned how to fight fire with fire. You've learned in your fear to deal with things improperly. But I want you to come to me, and I want you to learn of me, for I'm meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So I want every one of us, I want every one of you to have hope. It doesn't matter what things have been like. It doesn't matter what things are like today in your life. You may want to run away. You might want to get away, not only from others, but you want to get away from yourself. Some people so much want to get away from themselves. They're so tired of things that as they've been that they think about maybe just killing themselves. They want to kill themselves before they kill others. I implore you. I beg you. Don't do it. There is a solution. There is a cure. There is a savior, a rescuer, one who has answers, who has help. No matter how imprisoned you might feel in your situation, in yourself, no matter how helpless or hopeless and out of control you feel, no matter how frightened you are, even by yourself, I want you to know that there is hope and help in Jesus. And I have experienced it in my life in a remarkable way that gives that experience of his help. He's a very present help for us. He knows how to secure us in a life of long suffering and patience. And you don't even recognize the person you once were. And not only do you have hope now for yourself, but you have hope for others. I'll tell you, when I got saved, I reached out to my dad. I invited my dad to church, and he was surprised at me. I was a wild kid. I was like him. I was in the bars and in the streets and didn't know anything about this Jesus outside of having heard about him in church. Growing up in a Catholic church, I heard about him, but I didn't know him. And then I got genuinely saved and rescued, and Christ came into my life. And I said, Dad, you want to go to church with me? He said, what, do you become one of these holy rollers? I said, I guess so. You want to come to church with me? And he came to church. For years he came to church with me. shortly after we went to a church and there was an altar call, and he was asleep for most of the message. But when the altar call came, lo and behold, he raised his hand and he went up and he said the sinner's prayer. But he went years, and there were things in his life that didn't change. And I mourn that I didn't see the change. We can go to church, we can say the sinner's prayer, but when does Christ actually really come into our life? We have to be at a point of desperation. My father had diabetes. He had sepsis. He had his legs amputated, and there was a point in the nursing home when my dad called upon the name of the Lord. He called upon Jesus. He cried out, "Jesus, save me. Save me, Jesus." And he truly called upon the Lord. And Christ came into his life. And I saw genuine salvation. And this is what's necessary in any of our lives. It's not religion. It's not joining a church. It's not joining the right religion. It's Christ. Christ himself is our Savior, our rescuer, not just somebody who will get us to heaven when we die, but somebody who could save us from our sin and our inadequacy to overcome our sin here and now. And there is a verse in Isaiah 45:22 where God says, "Look unto me and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth." I don't care where you are. I don't care whether you're in a wilderness because you've run. I don't care whatever country you live in, whatever situation you find yourself in, from the extremities of your situation. You might think you're so far gone. There's no hope for you. I dealt with this in Rikers, people feeling they were too far gone. They were too stained. They were hopeless causes. I will tell you, nobody is too far gone for Jesus. He can save the worst. He can bring any of us, when we cry out to him, up and out of a horrible pit that we're in, of miry clay that we've been stuck in. We can't seem to get going and get out of our situation and out of our predicament and out of our sin. And he lifts us out and he puts our feet upon a rock, and that rock is Jesus. And he establishes our going, and he puts a new song in our mouth, even praise for our God. And what I hope to do in this series is not just inform your heads. I want to bring these things out to you so that you have an understanding of anger and the different forms, and have an understanding of how Jesus was able to overcome. Unapologetically, relentlessly, we're going to point to Jesus and no other. I hope you stay with us. Jesus is mankind's only hope. Mankind looking anywhere else, looking to psychiatry, looking to drugs, looking to religion, is not the answer. The answer is found in one place and one place alone, and that is who God has given us. He has exalted Jesus Christ and given him a name above every name, and that name is the only name given under heaven by which men must be saved. There is no other name. There is nowhere else we're to look. He says, "I am God and there's none else. I am Savior and there's none else." And Father God has appointed Jesus Christ to be mankind's Savior. This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance. Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. And Paul already claimed that he was the worst that ever lived. And he was quite an angry man. If God could save Paul, he could save anybody. He can rescue anybody. So that's what I want to do. I want us to yes, be looking at the whole topic of anger. I want us to look and understand that there's an epidemic afoot. But I want us to, most importantly, know that there is a cure, and I want us to investigate that cure. Let's look at Jesus. Let's look at Jesus and find in him our hope and the one who could help us. We've looked today at the madman, the subject of fear. In our next lesson, we're going to look at the madman, a subject of fascination. And yes, we are perplexed. We don't understand. Let's understand truly, not only what the problem is, but more importantly, what the solution is.